My name is Frieda Afary. I'm an Iranian American librarian and translator in Los Angeles. I'm the author of the forthcoming book, Socialist, Feminism, A New Approach, and producer of Iranian Progressives in Translation. Today, I'm speaking with Oksana Dutchak, a Ukrainian socialist feminist inside Ukraine. She is a sociologist and co-editor of the journal Comments, which is comments.com.ua if you'd like to take a look at it. It's a very interesting journal. Oksana, thank you for joining me for this conversation. And I just wanted to say that my heart goes out to you and the Ukrainian people who are resisting so courageously, resisting Putin's brutal invasion and his campaign of mass murder and annihilation. So I will be asking you some questions and really appreciate your taking the time under such difficult conditions to meet for this conversation. So my first question—
Thank you for inviting.
Thank you. My first question is, can you tell us about the current situation of the popular resistance against Putin's invasion? What is happening to women and children, and how are women participating in the resistance?
Currently, there is a war going on, and a lot of the majority of resistance is done by army and by so-called territorial defense. It's units, military units, which are organized in different cities and towns and villages, which are organized by volunteers. So additionally to army, they are also struggling to defend their settlements and their towns. Beside that, there is a lot of done by volunteers in terms of supply, including like military supply, including supply of humanitarian staff, and helping refugees who are fleeing from the war zone. Currently, the strategy of Russia, of Putin, is definitely, it varies from place to place. There is a front line where a lot of like fight is going on, and they're also shelling densely populated cities and specifically targeting residential areas and areas where people are hiding from bombs. Like yesterday, for example, in Mariupol, it's a city, the biggest city in eastern part of Ukraine, which is still under government control. It is basically isolated now, so there are something like 300,000 people in total isolation for like 2 weeks. And the city is heavily shelled. Like now they say that from 80 to 90% of buildings are almost damaged. So they are either totally destroyed or they're damaged. And there is no electricity, water, nothing basically. So it's a total humanitarian catastrophe. And yesterday there was a bomb which was dropped on the theater. And the theater was where something like 1,000 people were hiding in the basement of the theater. Luckily, there are news that the basement could stand the blast, and people, at least not, we cannot say that they are like dead or something. So there are talks that some people are saved. But the city is in very drastic condition, and the same is in some other cities. Mariupol is the worst case, but the situation is very bad also in Kharkiv and Chernihiv, especially Chernihiv also, because it's also totally isolated from the rest of the territory, so it's encircled. So in these cities, the resistance is basically done by army. Because people cannot resist in such conditions when bombs are falling out of the sky. But there are also territories which are under temporal occupation of Russia already, like in southern part of the country, where there were no big fights and there were no mass shelling of the cities, and there people are going to the peaceful rallies. So it's Russian military is in the cities, and people go on the peaceful rallies and trying to show them their protest and their discontent with the situation. And also in these cities, like Russian armies, they take hostages. They basically kidnap people, kidnap activists, volunteers, and people from local authorities and journalists. So there was numerous cases like this reported. So it's different in different places, but basically a huge amount of population is mobilized in one or another way, either to do the fight, to fight with arms, or or to volunteer, support, evacuate, and provide humanitarian relief and supply and everything. So that's how the situation is now. And speaking about the situation of women and men and children, these conditions, like we have something like probably more than 3 million people who are refugees, who flee across the border. It's mostly women with children and also elder people. And there are a lot of displaced people inside the country, and of course the situation is not good. I mean, they are trying to flee from bombs, but and a lot of is done on the ground by authorities and volunteers to provide them with some place to stay, so they would have food and all the necessary stuff. But still, I mean, their situation is very, I would say, I mean, they cannot say what will be next. And for example, there are cases when they flee from one city to another, and then that city becomes also dangerous, and they have to flee further to the west. And of course, they have problems with getting, I don't know, roof over their head and some food and medicine and everything. Though a lot of people are trying to help them and support, but still, I mean, of course, it's hard. And this the situation where families are separated often, like when women who have partners, they still have to flee by themselves and take children, for example. So a lot of responsibility and different dangers and different problems fall on their shoulders, unproportionally, of course. But yeah, it's how it usually happens during the war.
Yes. Yes.
And also, speaking about crossing the border, there are also cases reported that there are problems with human trafficking, like with sex trafficking, that and a government issue official statements and warnings to be careful what you should do, what you should not do, to avoid like big problems and to not to be in a dangerous situation in the end. So there are many levels of that, of course. And also the problem is that the medical infrastructure is either, like in some cities, it's bombed, so it's destroyed, and it's overwhelmed in other cities, also because of wounds and because of other problems. And of course, it also put the pressure, like there are cases when women were given birth in the basement during the shelling, and there was a case when the maternity hospital was bombed in Mariupol, and like at least one woman and a unborn child died because of that. And so of course it's the situation of women including is also very hard.
Yes, definitely. That image of the pregnant woman who was bombed when the maternity ward was bombed, brought out of the building was really tragic, and then she died, of course, afterward. And women, as with all wars, bear the brunt of the assault on their bodies and the bodies of their children.
Yeah.
And in general, though, I think that at least the media has done a good job in showing the humanity of the Ukrainian struggle and the Ukrainian people's resistance. And that creates a lot of global sympathy toward the struggle, which is absolutely necessary at this moment. Which brings me to my next question, which is Putin claims to quote unquote denazify Ukraine, and he completely denies the reality of Ukraine having a Jewish president, Volodymyr Zelensky, who's a liberal, and a population whose majority voted for a Jewish liberal president. Putin himself is a white supremacist ethno-nationalist and has strong support from the extreme right on the global scale, ranging from Donald Trump to Marine Le Pen and from Jair Bolsonaro to Narendra Modi. At the same time, the racist treatment of African migrants and immigrants, men and women, by some Ukrainian border guards have aroused serious concerns. Within the global South, there is also concern about the double standard of the Western media, which has done such a good job in showing the humanity of the Ukrainians, but has by comparison done far less in showing the humanity of those Syrians, Afghans, Iraqis, Sudanese, Palestinians, Iranians, or people in Myanmar who are fighting native authoritarian regimes and outside imperialist powers. So prior to the invasion, Putin's latest invasion of Ukraine, how were Ukrainian progressives showing their opposition to racism and specifically anti-Black racism? How were they expressing their solidarity with struggles in the Middle East, Africa, Myanmar? How are they helping refugees from the global South? What do you think brings our struggles together?
Well, first of all, I would say that, of course, Ukraine had a problem with far right, and I was participating for some years in monitoring of the far right violence in Ukraine. But the level of it was not high. I would not say it was higher than in many other countries, because I mean, probably all countries have this problem. The Ukrainian case was peculiar in that sense that because the war have been going on here for 8 years already, but localized in eastern part of the country. Because of the war, Ukrainian far right was quite militarized, I would say. That was a problem, of course, and Putin used it as a pretext for his actions now. But of course, this phenomena and peculiarity of Ukrainian right wing, it didn't give him any excuse, a real excuse for what he have done. Speaking about the cases with African students and probably some, I don't know, maybe also Indian students on the border, there were cases like that reported at the beginning. There was a special statement by the government that all the people should be treated equally. And there was some additional hotlines and registration organized for students for foreign students who want to flee the country, so they will be supported in their escape from the country. There was also a case when, for example, when the humanitarian corridors from different cities were discussed. There was the issue in Sumy. It's a city in Ukraine, which was also encircled basically and heavily shelled. And there were some universities where quite a lot of foreign students studied, like students from India, from Turkey. And at least my impression was that the humanitarian corridor for that city was opened specifically thanks to that students, because their governments were pressing on Russia to open that humanitarian corridor, because there were probably around 1,000 of students from India, Turkey, and other countries who could not leave the city, and it was very dangerous to stay there. In general, speaking about attitudes to refugees and people from other ethnic background in Ukraine, I would say that as in probably at least in post-Soviet region, it was not of course, it was not a perfect attitude, far from perfect attitude, especially, and there were some, I have at least, I know people who are working in different NGOs who have been working with refugees in Ukraine for a while. And I know that Ukrainian state system, like bureaucracy and everything, it was very hostile to refugees. It was really hard to get the refugee status here, and it was a big problem, of course. And the support for refugees was also not very, very good. So there was a problem also on this level of state authorities, and people from these NGOs were trying to solve these problems and to support people and to make some structural changes with these problems. Speaking about solidarity and campaigning with other popular struggle all over the world, I cannot say that they were prominent in Ukraine. That's also true. So like every time like something like this unfolds, like for example in Syria or Myanmar or other countries, it appeared in news, of course, but there were no popular discussion about it, I would say. And attitudes, of course, were very different. There were some groups which expressed solidarity and so on, but I wouldn't say that the solidarity was massive or something. So the attitudes were quite different, very different depending on the group, but there were no mass solidarity in this respect. And also, because as I mentioned, the war in Ukraine started 8 years ago, basically, it was not a full-scale war, it was a localized war. There were a lot of internally displaced people also in Ukraine, like almost like 1.6 million or something like that, who fled from eastern part of the country to central and western part of the country because of war. A lot of things were done, like of course, to support them, but there were also some kind of xenophobia sometimes unfolding, that those people, like I don't know, like they take our jobs, so they could. So the reaction, I would say, would be as in many other countries, and the aspect of solidarity was bigger when we speak about Ukrainian population fleeing from war, but when we're speaking about international solidarity, it was not prominent. The different thing was probably that, like the different case was probably in the case of Belarus, when they had this mass uprising last year. 2 years ago, when they had elections and mass protests, and a lot of people had to flee from repressions. In that case, solidarity was quite, I would say, visible. So they, on the level of the state, on the level of civil society, but otherwise, and when we're speaking about other countries, the solidarity was not that prominent. I also have now in mind that probably these tragic events will somehow change the popular perception of the phenomenon of refugees in Ukraine. So people who have this experience by themselves, who know that people are fleeing to Europe, not to have a great life, but just fleeing from war and trying to save their kids and themselves and have a peaceful, like just normal life without being afraid of bombing. I at least want to believe that this experience will also change something on the level of how society perceive this events like this in other countries, and probably maybe it will bring a little bit more solidarity into how people behave and how they support other people.
Yes, I agree. In other words, even now, I think we're seeing more references, for instance, in the reporting when reporters talk about the assault on Ukraine. They also, for instance, make references to Syria. In a couple of instances, I've heard references made to Iraq or Afghanistan, but a lot of references to Syria and how Putin's aerial bombing of Syria and his war of annihilation there was similar to what he's doing in Ukraine right now. So hopefully that'll create more sympathy for the Syrian struggle, because the Syrians are still there and they're still suffering, and there are a lot of Syrian refugees in Europe. And another way in which, I'm sorry, did you want to say something before?
Yeah, I just remember that another part of the question was how Europe perceived the situation and the refugees coming from Ukraine comparing to what happened with refugees from other countries. And it's also very obvious and very, very dramatic, this difference, because they did for Ukrainians what they have never done for anybody,
yes,
like opening the border and simplifying the procedure as far as possible. Then you can go without documents, without proper documents, and your I don't know, your animals can go without proper documents, and they organized additional trains, and so etc. etc. So the support is really enormous, and I'm really grateful for that support, because it makes, life of people, of especially vulnerable people like women with kids, it makes their life easier, and they have far more opportunities to escape the war. But of course, there is this question of how and why it comes up like this. And unfortunately, here, I think a lot of reflections should be made by many people, and probably we should speak about it like more and more, because obviously the attitude, for example, if you speak about the recent so-called Polish border crisis, when people were stuck on the border with Poland and were not able to go back to Belarus, and were not able to, Poland was also not letting them in, and they spent like a lot of time there, basically in woods, like before somebody thought what to do with them. And the difference is, of course, like astonishing, and there are a lot of things to think about, because obviously there is a level of racism involved here, and there are a level of like which people are perceived like who deserve to be protected and who not. And I think here also what played the role is that people from Poland, for example, they have more empathy for our situation, because they think that at some point they can be also in this situation. So for them, and for some other countries like for Moldova also, Russia is a potential aggressor. And so when they see how the situation develops in Ukraine, they have this more empathy to Ukrainian people comparing to people from other countries, because they kind of feel that we are fighting with their potential enemy or something like that. But of course, the issue of explicit or implicit racism is also involved here.
Yeah, and at the same time, this becomes an opportunity for those who oppose racism to say, look, this treatment of Ukrainian refugees by so many in Poland, the way in which they welcome them with open arms, and the way in which they also welcome unaccompanied children, this should be a model for how refugees should be treated everywhere. For instance, where I live in the United States, there are Central American refugees and a lot of unaccompanied children fleeing war in Central American countries, and gang warfare and state warfare. And the right-wing extremists in the US treat them as if they are animals. Whereas if you compare that to how Poles are treating Ukrainian refugees, we should say, look, this is the way they should be treated. They are human beings fleeing war, and we should welcome them with open arms and give them opportunities and give them a place to live that's comfortable, and food and rest and other possibilities for them to thrive, and at the same time fight Putin's invasion and help the Ukrainians win. So toward that aim, another issue which I think both the two of us as socialist feminists feel have a common views on is the issue of relating Putin's invasion to rape and misogyny. And here, let me read the question. Before his full-scale invasion, Putin in a press conference, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Putin in a press conference on Ukraine made a reference to the lyrics of a 1990s Russian song about raping a dead woman, meaning that Ukraine should accept the rape whether it likes it or not. Are Ukrainian feminists reaching out to feminists and Me Too activists around the world and demanding support on the basis of opposition to Putin's misogyny?
It was voiced by some feminists when this outrageous speech was made, of course. No, but I wouldn't say that there was some systematic appealing to the more global, original, at least feminist movement to emphasize this issue. So there it was voiced, but it was not like voiced systematically or with some kind of message. And honestly, I would not say it would change anything. It would change anything at that point. But yeah, of course, we observe like it's not the only case when we see this kind of very patriarchal and like very misogynist speeches and actions done by government of Russia. For example, like this, what in general what is happening in the rhetoric is a very modeled abusive behavior of traditional abusive partnership. So they perceive like when the most dangerous, they say at least that the most dangerous moment in abusive relationships is usually when a woman wants to leave. So this traditional talk is that, oh, but if your relationships are so bad, if he is so bad, why don't you leave? And the opposition, like our counter argument against this kind of this way of thinking, that many women are killed, especially particularly in that moment when they decide to leave. And this is very obvious parallel to what is happening now. So when the Ukrainian society decided to go its own way, I would not judge that way, saying whether it's good or bad, but it was the way which society was deciding to do, or government of the society decided to do, and like Putin decided he doesn't want us to do that. So that is a very typical abusive behavior of like this traditional male-dominated hierarchy. So this is obvious in many aspects. All this rhetoric about we are saving Ukraine and not destroying it, which is totally like insane, because basically what they are doing, they are destroying the country and making people suffering. But in their perception, they are doing it for better. And this rhetoric, which of Russian propaganda, that they are doing it for better for us, like it's totally like within all this patriarchal hierarchical models of behavior. But I wouldn't say, I think we still have to rethink it, and I think like academic and popular feminism will still rethink this kind of rhetoric and this kind of action, because the parallels are very obvious. But it's not, I wouldn't say it is done now, but for obvious reasons, because now most people have other stuff to do. But I think this should be also rethinked, and to think in terms of how the power structures operate in this world, like political power structure, how they are related to this patriarchal power structures and how they are built in. But I also think that Russia is also a kind of, well, not the outstanding, but maybe a little bit particular case, because they have this on the level of politics, they have this mode of behaving and doing politics, which takes roots in a very like old school misogynist, and I would say criminal behavior. So they have all this way of speaking and way of speaking not only to their opponents but even to each other. So it's very chauvinistic and very misogynist way of behaving in politics in general.
Yes, absolutely, and it's so important for us to draw those connections between the invasion and patriarchy. And to extend that further now, I wanted to ask you a question about Putin and his and how we can explain his behavior. So around the world, many have condemned Putin as an insane dictator promoting a war of annihilation. But Putin is not just an evil individual. He represents a racist, misogynist, authoritarian form of state capitalism. He was a KGB agent in East Germany under the Soviet Union. He was one of the architects of the war on Chechnya. He ordered the massive aerial bombing of Syria in 2015 and 2016 to destroy the progressive and moderate wing of the Syrian uprising against the authoritarian regime of Bashar al-Assad. He has used chemical and biological warfare in Syria and on the Russian opposition as well. He's a master of disinformation and has been ordering the arrest of thousands of anti-war protesters inside Russia. How do you analyze Putin and how he came to be who he is now, and what motivates his actions?
I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer this question. I think there are quite good historical historians who do this job better, but I will try. Now, I would say that in general, in all the crimes he have done in many places, not only in Ukraine, the sad thing that he has not done something which was not done by other powerful governments of the world. So it's not that he is doing something outstanding, but as my friend historian points out, he unlike like U.S. in Iraq, for example, he has done it in a European country, let's say in brackets. So in terms that he put these practices which were generally acceptable by the powerful of the world, so at least they allowed themselves to do that, and they didn't pay attention to public outrage which this actually promoted. The difference here is that he did it on in the borderland of Europe, which was something kind of which US did not allow themselves to do until at least for now. So yeah, of course, they did it in the 90s in Serbia, but in general, it's like for at least for 30 years, they didn't do it in so close geographically locations to so-called civilized world. So that's the biggest difference here. If I'm trying for myself to explain like why and how come that it happens like this, definitely it's not. I would not stick with purely psychological explanations. I don't really like this mode of thinking that it's about him being insane or him being mad or something like that. Definitely not that way. So probably he has some peculiarities of personality, but it's not the main problem here, especially because we are speaking not about one person. We are speaking about a group of people who are in power and who are doing things like that. Sometimes I have a feeling that, of course, he has a kind of imperial, and people around him has a kind of imperial way of thinking, a chauvinistic way of thinking, which is obvious, and it was obvious for many years, actually, like in their public speeches and their like doctrines and everything. But I think at least part of the people, they didn't take it seriously. Like, okay, they are talking about this restoration of big Russia or whatever, but they didn't. People didn't perceive people outside Russia didn't perceive this talk seriously, and probably they are too bad for us. Probably we should have perceived them more seriously. But also, you should. I sometimes have a feeling that he kind of created, and people around him created kind of reality by their propaganda, which they are using quite intensively, targeting their own people and people around the world who kind of listen to them. And sometimes I have feelings that they at some point they started to believe in this, like in this their own way of propaganda. They really believe that we have kind of Nazi government or something, and they probably really believed at some point that people will greet them with flowers, like instead of trying to fight them back. And that's astonishing. So this kind of reality which they created for the reasons of propaganda, they kind of believed in this reality, and this is really amazing. But I think in general, in historical perspective, there is and there should be and there will be more good analysis how this illusion and how this kind of mode of action came into being. So I think it's obviously it didn't start like yesterday. It didn't start in February. It didn't start a year ago. There was a route to this kind of state when they have justification for such kind of awful actions. And so in general I would say that, but I also what is also very scary now, because as I read some analytics, they say that Putin, he put himself into the corner, like he cannot lose now, because in Russian, this kind of Russian political tradition, this very patriarchal tradition, nobody will work with a loser. So if he loses, he will immediately be he won't stay where he is. So he will be there will be some kind of elite rebellion or something. So they won't be governed by a person who lost the war. So basically, he put himself into the corner where he cannot lose. And in the situation when he will be losing, he can do something, I don't know, he will be basically unpredictable. And that's what scares me and I think many people around.
Yes, everyone is worried about that he would use chemical warfare as in Syria, or biological warfare, nuclear warfare. All of those are possibilities. And so the only way of really stopping Putin, obviously, is to hopefully for the most effective way of stopping Putin would be to have opposition from inside Russia, obviously. And that's my next question. What do you think about the anti-war opposition within Russia? Do you have ties to Russian anti-war feminists? What is the state of solidarity with progressives also in Belarus and Kazakhstan, which had popular uprisings in 2020 and earlier this year?
I would say that at the beginning, I had far more hope for Russian opposition to the war. I have a lot of connection with, well, not a lot, but some connections with the Russian progressive left and progressive feminists. And of course, these people were opposing war, and they did their best at the point when the war started. So they organized rallies and single pickets, and they organized, well, basically all they could. But unfortunately, the civil society in Russia is broken, basically, by many years of oppression, by many years of repression, by propaganda, by state propaganda. And unfortunately, it didn't it wasn't massive, and unfortunately, I expected it. The resistance would be bigger, but people who are active in feminism or in left movement, of course, they did what they could, but there were too few of them, and they were quite easily repressed, and part of them had to flee the country and so on. But in general, obviously there was no popular protest against war. For example, in 2014, when Putin did the annexation of the Crimea Peninsula, the protest was far bigger. Like there were really tens of thousands of people marching in Moscow. Nothing like this happened this time. So there were quite big protests of several thousand people, but they were very fast arrested, and a lot of them were arrested and repressed and so on. And there were all these legislative changes made, when the denial of, or how they call it, when so you cannot, in Russia, you cannot basically publicly call this a war. If you call it a war, you can be fined, or I don't know, so there will be a repression against you. So they made all these changes also to legislation. So basically, repressions became even bigger. So unfortunately, I would say that as for now, I don't see that this popular opposition to war will fastly emerge, and probably it won't emerge at all. One chance, I would say, that when this can happen, if Putin would dare to involve the conscripts massively, like people who are not the professional military people, but who are just serving in armies terms. So he has been involving them into the war, but not massively. But they were definitely on the front line. But at least for now, he does not use them massively. And I think and his people around him understand that they should not do it, because if they will start like a really mass mobilization and involvement of common people into the warfare, then the popular outrage and popular protest may increase, because probably, and I want to believe in that still a lot of people are not motivated really to come here and to kill like Ukrainian people. At least I have this hope. But in general, I would say that I had at the beginning, and probably still have now, some hopes for elite rebellion, which is sad, because as a progressive leftists and feminists, we should not probably rely on elites. But unfortunately, in country like Russia, when the opposition have been under the huge pressure for years, and the civil society is very weak and demoralized and repressed, it appears that in the end, you want to believe that the elite rebellion will happen.
Yeah, that is indeed very sad that you think that the opposition inside Russia would not be able to stop him. I will be interviewing a Russian feminist anti-war activist in a few days, and we'll be getting her views on this as well. Hopefully the situation is fluid, and the continued resistance of the Ukrainians and the humanity of their struggle will make an impact. I think that's really the most effective way to create an impact. Although the problem is that inside Russia, the disinformation is so powerful that people don't have access to real news. And so when they don't have access to real news, how will they make judgments that are correct? That is truly a problem. And we should.
I honestly want to believe that maybe I'm mistaken, and the situation is quite dynamic, and maybe you're right, and at some point we will see that some popular protest is increasing. But that's how I see it at this point. But maybe we can definitely. I would rather hope that it will happen.
Yes, I mean the woman reporter who worked for a state television station, who created a sign saying "End this war" and "End the fratricide," and they're telling lies here, and held that up in front of the camera. That was so courageous of her. And
that was, but here I would also add that I have ambiguous feeling about this kind of protest, because like you should understand that in Ukrainian society it was mostly perceived not that well, because I understand that I want to perceive this event as a sign that something is changing. But I cannot say that I praise this woman a lot or something, because she has been working on this state television for years, probably, and she was part of this machine of disinformation and propaganda. And I'm of course happy to an extent that even in the heart of this machine of propaganda and disinformation, there are people who started to think that maybe something is wrong. But also I cannot, at this moment when such an outrageous tragedy is happening, I cannot forget that she has been working there for years and she was part of it. So I also have this but at least I want to perceive this as a positive event, in the sense that we see how even in the very epicenter of this machine, people start to do this kind of actions, which may be a good sign for the future development of the event.
Yes, I think so. I really think so. And let's talk about global solidarity as well. So, and this is my last question. How can Putin's invasion be stopped from the vantage point of global solidarity? Because you already talked about what you see as possibilities within Russia. what can progressives around the world do to support the resistance of the Ukrainian people?
Well, I think that basically what they have been already doing, but probably to go on and not to give that up. So first of all is a supply of humanitarian and military support to those who perceive it as acceptable. And I think that at this point, I hope that number of people who perceive it as acceptable will grow. And also another side of it is a political pressure. So the government of their own countries will continue with putting pressure on Russian government. These are the two main components, I would say. So supply and political pressure, and also, of course, I hope that this good model, as you named it, I totally agree with it. Good model of treating refugees will go on also, and I would say that at least now I see the overwhelming solidarity in this respect, especially in neighboring countries. I also am afraid a bit that at some point it will end, and instead we will have the wave of xenophobia against refugees, because like now in many countries they are really overwhelmed, especially Poland, with Ukrainian refugees, and I'm afraid that at some point it may lead to some right-wing sentiments instead of this kind of development. But maybe I'm also wrong. So, but I think at this point this should be a lot of things should be done in these three directions. So supply, humanitarian relief for refugees, and political pressure, because different countries reacted very differently. And for example, today somebody told me that, for example, Israel, instead of when some countries were providing visa-free regime for Ukrainians, Israel instead canceled visa-free regime for Ukrainians, which is also kind of surprising development for me. But anyway, so this kind of politics of supporting people and so on, they should go on. Also, probably, but here I'm not the specialist, or I don't know much about it. But I think in terms of United Nations, like some things can be done also on the level of providing peacekeeper corps. But I'm not, again, that's what people who know more about it are telling also around me. But in long-term perspective, I also think we should draw our lessons about how ineffective probably at some point this global system of governments appeared, that it couldn't react effectively. So maybe we should rethink the existing mechanisms of guaranteeing security for states like Ukraine and many other states, because as you probably know, in 2014, like when Russia annexed Crimea, like this it breached the international agreement, Budapest Memorandum, like which was signed in 90s by Ukraine and some other countries, including Russia, when Ukraine was giving up its nuclear weapon. And in return, there was some security guarantees signed that its territory would be sovereign, and like nobody will violate its territorial sovereignty and integrity. In the end, we see how these mechanisms are not working, and they didn't work in 2014, and they are not working now. And probably some basic and some systematic changes needed in this global agreements and the global system of governance. But yeah, that's what I think people who have been thinking about it for years should make some conclusions on the ground of this awful situation.
I totally agree with you. We have so much work to do. We need such vast transformations in this world. The current system we have is just completely not viable, and it's destroying humanity. All the more reason for us to support the Ukrainian resistance and do everything we can in any way we can to help the struggle in Ukraine against Putin's brutal invasion. Because honestly, I think that if the Ukrainian struggle is defeated, it's a defeat for all of humanity. It means that authoritarianism will become stronger, and then other countries will be next. And so I thank you for this interview. I look forward to continuing the dialogue with you and doing everything that I can to help. And I hope that you will stay safe, since you're currently in Ukraine and you're facing a lot of dangers.
Thank you, Frieda. Thank you for inviting, and for your warm words.
Thank you.